Sarah Mitchell had always been fascinated by the British Royal Guards. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, she had seen countless videos of tourists trying to make these stoic soldiers break character. She watched as people danced, sang, and made ridiculous faces, yet the guards remained perfectly still, their expressions frozen in time. Now, standing outside Buckingham Palace on a crisp autumn morning, she was about to become part of that very tradition. The 32-year-old teacher had saved for 3 years to make this trip to London. She had dreamed of visiting the historic sites, tasting authentic fish and chips, and yes, seeing the famous guards up close. Sarah wasn't the type to seek attention. Her friends back home would describe her as quiet and reserved, someone who preferred books to parties and meaningful conversations to small talk. But something about this moment felt different. Perhaps it was the jet lag, or maybe the excitement of finally being in a place she had only seen in photographs. But Sarah felt a strange pull toward one particular guard. He stood perfectly straight near the palace gates, his red uniform immaculate, his tall bearskin hat adding to his imposing presence. His face was expressionless, eyes fixed on some distant point that only he could see. Sarah noticed how young he looked beneath the formal attire. She estimated he couldn't be more than 25 or 26 years old. There was something in the set of his jaw that reminded her of her younger brother, who had joined the military 2 years ago. The crowd around her was thick with tourists from every corner of the world. She heard French, Spanish, Japanese, and German being spoken around her. Children pointed and giggled while their parents snapped endless photographs. Some teenagers were already planning their attempts to get a reaction from the guards, their voices loud with bravado and youthful confidence. Sarah moved closer, her camera hanging unused around her neck. She wasn't interested in taking the typical tourist photo. She wanted to understand what it took to stand so still, to remain so composed while hundreds of strangers gawked and tested your patience. As a teacher, she dealt with children testing boundaries every day, but this seemed like an entirely different level of discipline and control. A group of college students rushed past her, laughing as one of them approached a different guard and started making monkey noises. The guard didn't even blink. His companion standing nearby remained equally unmoved. Sarah felt a pang of embarrassment for the students. These weren't statues or robots. They were real people doing their job, serving their country with dignity and honor. She found herself standing directly in front of the young guard she had noticed earlier. Up close, she could see the fine details of his uniform, the shine of his boots, the precise way his rifle was positioned. His breathing was so controlled that his chest barely moved. Sarah wondered how long he had been standing there. An hour, 2 hours? How did his feet not ache? How did he manage to keep his face so perfectly blank? Without really planning it, Sarah started speaking. Her voice was soft at first, almost hesitant. She didn't expect a response. She knew the guards weren't supposed to interact with tourists. But something compelled her to share what was on her mind. She told him about her brother, about how proud she was when he completed his basic training. She mentioned how she had always admired people who chose to serve, who put duty above comfort. The words flowed easier as she continued. She wasn't trying to make him break character. She genuinely wanted him to know that at least one person in this crowd saw him as more than just a tourist attraction. She spoke about her journey to London, about losing her father the previous year, about how this trip was something she and her dad had planned together before cancer took him away too soon. Other tourists began to notice her one-sided conversation. Some smiled sympathetically, assuming she was just another visitor trying a different tactic to get a reaction. Others looked annoyed, waiting for her to finish so they could take their photos. A few seemed genuinely curious about what she was saying, moving closer to listen. Sarah's eyes began to well up as she talked about her father. He had been a veteran himself, a man who understood duty and sacrifice. He had told her stories about standing watch during his service, about the pride that came with wearing the uniform. She had promised him she would make this trip, that she would stand before these guards and remember all the lessons he had taught her about respect and honor. The guard remained motionless, but Sarah thought she detected the slightest change in his expression. Perhaps it was just her imagination, wishful thinking brought on by emotion and exhaustion. She wiped her eyes quickly, feeling self-conscious now about the speech she had just delivered to a stranger who hadn't asked to hear it. She was about to step back, to disappear into the crowd and let this moment pass when something unexpected happened. The guard's lips moved, barely perceptible, forming words that only she was close enough to hear. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The crowd around them continued their chatter, completely unaware that something remarkable was occurring. In that instant, everything Sarah thought she knew about these silent sentinels was about to change. The guard's eyes, which had been fixed straight ahead, flickered toward her for just a fraction of a second. And in that brief glance, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. It was acknowledgement, understanding, and something else she couldn't quite name. The wall between performer and audience, between duty and humanity, was about to crack in a way no one expected. The words the guard whispered were so quiet that Sarah had to lean in slightly to catch them. His lips barely moved, maintaining the appearance of complete stillness to anyone watching from a distance. Those 3 simple words changed everything about her understanding of this moment. He had said, "Thank you, miss." Sarah's eyes widened in shock. She hadn't expected any response, let alone one so genuine and filled with emotion. The guard's voice was young, with a distinct London accent that somehow made him seem more real, more human than the uniform suggested. She stood frozen for a moment, unsure how to react. Should she respond? Should she walk away? The rulebook for this situation didn't exist in her mind. Before she could decide, the guard spoke again, his voice still barely audible, his posture unchanged. "Your father sounds like he was a good man." Sarah felt tears threatening to spill over. She nodded slowly, knowing he could see her even though his eyes had returned to their forward position. "He was the best," she whispered back, matching his volume instinctively. Around them, the crowd continued their activities, oblivious to the quiet conversation happening in plain sight. A child tugged on his mother's sleeve, asking why the lady was crying. A tour guide announced facts about the palace through a megaphone, his voice carrying over the general noise. Street vendors called out, selling miniature guards and Union Jack flags. Life moved on normally for everyone else, but for Sarah and the guard, time seemed to have slowed down. The guard remained perfectly still for several more seconds before speaking again. "My grandfather served in the war. He passed last year too." Sarah's heart ached for him. Here was someone who understood loss, who knew what it meant to carry on when someone important was gone. She realized that beneath the ceremonial uniform and the strict protocols was a person dealing with the same griefs and challenges that everyone faced. The red coat and bearskin hat didn't make him immune to pain or sadness. "I'm sorry," Sarah said softly. "That must be so hard." The guard's jaw tightened slightly, the only visible sign of emotion. "He taught me about service, about doing your duty even when it's difficult. That's why I'm here." Sarah understood completely. Her father had taught her similar lessons, though in different contexts. He had shown her that real strength wasn't about being tough or unemotional. It was about showing up, doing what needed to be done, and treating people with dignity and respect. She saw those same qualities in this young man who was breaking protocol to acknowledge her humanity while maintaining his professional composure. "He'd be proud of you," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. A slight smile tugged at the corner of the guard's mouth, gone so quickly that Sarah wondered if she had imagined it. "Yours too, I reckon." The connection between them was unexpected and profound. 2 strangers from different countries, different backgrounds, united by shared loss and mutual respect. Sarah felt her initial nervousness disappearing, replaced by a warm sense of gratitude. She hadn't come to London looking for this moment, but now that it was happening, she recognized it as something special. "What's your name?" she asked, barely breathing the words. There was a pause. The guard seemed to be weighing whether to answer. Finally, he responded, "James. James Patterson. I'm Sarah. Sarah Mitchell. Nice to meet you, Sarah." His formality made her smile despite her tears. A police officer began walking in their direction, and Sarah sensed that their conversation needed to end soon. James must have sensed it too, because he spoke more quickly, his words still quiet but more urgent. "Listen, I shouldn't be talking. My sergeant will have my head if he catches me. But I wanted you to know that what you said meant something. We stand here every day and most people just see the uniform. They don't think about the person inside it. Your father raised you right." Sarah's throat tightened with emotion. "Thank you for your service, James. Both you and your grandfather. It matters more than you know." The police officer was getting closer, his eyes scanning the crowd. Sarah knew she needed to step back, to blend into the mass of tourists before James got in trouble. But there was one more thing she wanted to say. "I teach history back home," she said quickly, I tell my students about traditions like this, about honor and duty. Now I have a real story to share with them, about a guard who showed me that kindness and duty can exist together. James's eyes flickered toward her again, just for a heartbeat. Tell them it's not always easy. Tell them it's worth it anyway. Sarah nodded, committing his words to memory. She took a small step backward, then another. The police officer was now just a few feet away, speaking into his radio. Other tourists were beginning to notice that something had happened, though they weren't sure what. A few cameras pointed in their direction, people hoping to capture whatever moment they had missed. As Sarah retreated into the crowd, she kept her eyes on James. He had returned to his completely motionless state, his face once again an unreadable mask. To anyone just arriving, he looked exactly like every photograph and video ever taken of the Royal Guards. Still silent, unflappable, but Sarah knew better now. She had glimpsed the person behind the uniform, and that made all the difference. A woman next to her asked if she was all right. Noticing her tears, Sarah smiled and nodded, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "I'm fine," she said. "Better than fine, actually." The woman looked confused but smiled politely and moved on. Sarah remained at the edge of the crowd, watching James from a distance. She thought about her father, about how he would have loved this story. He would have appreciated James's dedication to duty and his willingness to offer comfort to a stranger. Her dad had always believed that the best people were those who could be strong and kind at the same time. Sarah found a bench across from where James stood and sat down, her legs suddenly feeling weak. The adrenaline from their conversation was wearing off, leaving her emotionally drained but strangely uplifted. She pulled out her phone, wanting to text her brother about what had just happened, but she hesitated. How could she explain something so simple yet so meaningful? A few whispered words had touched her more deeply than all the tourist attractions she had visited combined. From her new vantage point, she watched the changing of the guard ceremony begin to prepare. Officers moved with precision, their movements synchronized and practiced. James remained at his post, unwavering. Sarah wondered what he was thinking now. Was he regretting breaking protocol? Was he worried about consequences? Or was he like her, feeling that their brief exchange had been worth any risk? An elderly couple sat down on the bench next to Sarah. The woman was bundled in a thick coat despite the mild weather, and the man carried a walking stick. They spoke with Scottish accents, discussing their plans for the rest of the day. The woman noticed Sarah's tear-stained face and offered her a tissue from her purse. "Thank you," Sarah said, accepting it gratefully. "First time in London?" the woman asked kindly. Sarah nodded. "Yes, it's been quite an experience," the man chuckled. "The guards get to everyone eventually. There's something about them that makes you think, isn't there? My uncle was a guardsman back in the 60s. Tough job, standing in all weather, dealing with tourists. Most people don't realize they're actual soldiers, not just decorations." Sarah smiled, thinking about how perfectly he had captured what she had just learned. "I think I understand that better now," she said. The woman patted her hand. "You look like you've had a moment. Those are precious, dear. Hold on to it." After the couple moved on, Sarah continued to observe the scene before her. A group of school children in matching uniforms arrived with their teachers, notebooks in hand. They were clearly on an educational trip, and their teacher was explaining the history of the Royal Guard. The children listened with varying degrees of attention, some genuinely interested, others fidgeting and whispering to friends. One little girl, no more than 8 years old, broke away from the group and approached James. She held a small drawing in her hand, something she had apparently made. She held it up toward him, her voice piping and innocent as she said, "I drew this for you, Mr. Soldier. It's you with a smile." Sarah's heart melted watching the scene. The teacher rushed over to retrieve the child, apologizing profusely, but not before James did something remarkable. Without moving his head or changing his posture noticeably, he shifted his eyes downward for just a second to look at the drawing. The little girl beamed with pride, convinced he had seen her artwork. "Emily, come back here," the teacher said, gently pulling the child away. "I'm so sorry," she told James, even though she knew he wouldn't respond. But Sarah saw what others might have missed. As the little girl walked away, still clutching her drawing and chattering excitedly to her friends about how the guard had looked at her picture, the corner of James's mouth twitched upward for the briefest moment. It was gone in an instant, but it had been there, real human, warm, Sarah realized she was witnessing something most tourists never saw. She was seeing past the performance to the person underneath. James wasn't just good at his job because he could stand still and ignore distractions. He was good at it because he understood the balance between duty and humanity. He knew when a moment required strict adherence to protocol, and when a small gesture of kindness could be given without compromising his responsibilities. Her phone buzzed with a message from her friend back home, asking how the trip was going. Sarah started typing a response, but found it difficult to capture everything she was feeling. How could she explain that the highlight of her London visit wasn't Big Ben or the Tower of London or the British Museum? How could she convey that a quiet conversation with a guard she would probably never see again had somehow helped her process her grief in a way months of counseling hadn't quite managed? She settled for a simple response, saying that London was beautiful and she was having an amazing time. The deeper meaning could wait for when she got home, and could tell the story properly over coffee with her best friend, who would understand the significance. A commotion near the palace gates drew Sarah's attention. A tourist, clearly drunk despite it being early afternoon, was causing problems. He was shouting and trying to touch one of the guards, ignoring the clear signs and the warnings from police officers. Security personnel moved in quickly, escorting the man away while he continued to protest loudly. The guard he had been harassing never flinched, never acknowledged the disturbance. Sarah felt a renewed respect for the level of professionalism these soldiers maintained. She thought about the challenges James must face regularly. The drunk tourists were probably just the beginning. There would be people who mocked him, who tried to make him laugh or lose his composure. There would be long hours in uncomfortable weather, standing when his body wanted to sit, remaining alert when fatigue tried to set in. And through it all, he had to remember that he represented something larger than himself. He was a symbol of tradition, discipline, and national pride. Yet he had also shown her that being a symbol didn't mean abandoning your humanity. He had chosen to respond to her genuine emotion with genuine emotion of his own. He had shared his own loss and made her feel less alone in her grief. That took a different kind of courage than simply standing still. It took the courage to be vulnerable, even for just a few moments, even knowing it could have consequences. Sarah checked her watch and realized she had been sitting on the bench for over an hour. The changing of the guard ceremony was starting, and crowds were pressing in for a better view. She stood up, smoothing her jacket and picking up her bag. She took one last long look at James, committing the image to memory. His red uniform, his perfect posture, the way the afternoon light caught the brass buttons and made them shine. But more than the visual details, she wanted to remember how he had made her feel, seen, heard, understood. As if sensing her gaze, James's eyes moved almost imperceptibly in her direction. It lasted less than a second, but Sarah caught it. She raised her hand slightly in a small wave, knowing he couldn't wave back but hoping he would understand the gesture. Then she turned and walked away, joining the flow of tourists heading toward the ceremony. The changing of the guard ceremony was spectacular, just as Sarah had imagined it would be. The precision, the music, the pageantry of it all was impressive, but her mind kept drifting back to her conversation with James. She found herself looking for him among the guards participating in the ceremony, though she knew he was likely still at his original post or had been relieved by now. After the ceremony ended, Sarah wandered through London in a bit of a daze. She visited Westminster Abbey, where she lit a candle for her father. She walked along the Thames, watching boats pass by and street performers entertain crowds. She ate dinner at a small pub, ordering the fish and chips she had promised herself she would try. Everything was wonderful, yet her thoughts kept returning to Buckingham Palace and the unexpected connection she had made there. That evening, back in her hotel room, Sarah opened her laptop and began to write. She wasn't sure what she was creating at first. A journal entry, a letter. As the words flowed, she realized she was writing down everything about her encounter with James, every detail she could remember. She wanted to preserve the memory exactly as it had happened, knowing that over time details would fade and blur. She wrote about the way his voice had sounded, young and genuine. She described the moment when he thanked her, how those simple words had cracked open something in her heart that had been closed since her father's death. She captured the little girl with the drawing, the drunk tourist, the elderly Scottish couple. All of it wove together into a story about human connection in the most unlikely of circumstances. When she finished writing, It was past midnight. Sarah saved the document and attached it to an email to her brother. She added a short note explaining what had happened and hit send before she could second-guess herself. Then she climbed into bed, exhausted but content, and fell into the deepest sleep she had experienced in months. The next morning, Sarah woke to find several messages on her phone. Her brother had responded to her email with enthusiasm, saying the story had made him tear up during his breakfast. He thanked her for sharing it and said he understood why the moment had meant so much to her. Her best friend had also seen the email, which Sarah's brother had forwarded with permission, and she too was moved by the story. But there was another message that surprised Sarah. It was from a cousin she barely knew, a woman who worked for a small online magazine that published human interest stories. The cousin had also received the forwarded email and was asking if Sarah would be interested in having her story published. They wanted to share it with their readers as an example of finding connection in unexpected places. Sarah sat on the edge of her hotel bed, staring at the message. Her first instinct was to say no. The moment had been private, personal. Did she really want to share it with strangers? But then she thought about what James had said, about how people only saw the uniform and not the person inside. Maybe sharing this story could help others see the Royal Guards differently. Maybe it could remind people that everyone they meet is fighting their own battles and carrying their own grief. She typed out a cautious yes, saying she would be willing to discuss it further, but wanted to make sure James wouldn't get in trouble for having spoken to her. The cousin assured her that the story would be written sensitively and that no identifying details about the specific guard would be included. They just wanted to capture the emotional truth of the encounter. Over the next few days, as Sarah continued her London vacation, she worked with her cousin and an editor to refine the story. They asked her questions, helped her clarify certain moments, and suggested ways to make the narrative more impactful. Through the process, Sarah found herself reliving the experience again and again. But rather than diminishing its power, the retelling seemed to deepen her appreciation for what had happened. The story was published on a Wednesday, exactly 1 week after her conversation with James. Sarah was back home in Ohio by then, having returned to her normal life of lesson plans and grading papers. She didn't expect much response to the article. The magazine had a modest readership, and she figured a few people might read it and move on with their day. She was wrong. By Thursday morning, the story had been shared thousands of times on social media. People from around the world were commenting, sharing their own experiences with the Royal Guards and expressing appreciation for the reminder that everyone deserves to be seen as human. Some readers were critical, saying the Guard shouldn't have broken protocol, but most responses were overwhelmingly positive and emotional. Sarah's inbox filled with messages from strangers. A woman from Australia wrote about losing her mother and how the story had helped her feel less alone. A man from Canada thanked her for showing respect to military personnel. A teacher from Japan said she planned to translate the story for her English language students because it was such a good example of cross-cultural understanding and empathy. The attention was overwhelming and a bit uncomfortable. Sarah had never wanted to be in the spotlight. She had simply shared a personal moment that had touched her heart. But she couldn't deny that something meaningful was happening. The story was resonating with people because it spoke to a universal human need to connect, to be seen, to matter. 3 days after the article went viral, Sarah received an email that made her gasp out loud. It was from someone claiming to be James Patterson, the guard she had spoken with. Her first thought was that it must be a fake, someone pretending to be him for attention or as a prank. But as she read the message, details emerged that only the real James would know. He mentioned the little girl with the drawing and described the exact location where they had stood. He even referenced something Sarah had said, but hadn't included in her article about her father's love of British history. In the email, James explained that several of his fellow guardsmen had seen the article and recognized the story. They had teased him good-naturedly about being famous, but they had also understood why he had spoken to her. James wrote that he had been nervous about potential disciplinary action, but his commanding officer had ultimately decided that while breaking protocol was not ideal, the situation had been handled with dignity and had actually brought positive attention to the guards and their service. He thanked Sarah for how she had portrayed their interaction and for her respect toward him and his fellow soldiers. He mentioned that his family had read the article, including his grandmother, who had been his grandfather's widow. She had cried when she read about James mentioning his grandfather to Sarah, and she had asked James to tell Sarah that she appreciated her kind words about military service and sacrifice. James went on to say that the article had sparked conversations within his unit about the balance between maintaining protocol and showing humanity. His sergeant had used it as a teaching moment, discussing when small deviations from strict rules could actually enhance rather than diminish the dignity of their position. It wasn't permission to chat with every tourist, but it was acknowledgement that judgment and compassion had their place in service. Sarah read James's email 3 times, each reading bringing fresh tears to her eyes. She had worried so much about getting him in trouble, about causing problems for him with her decision to publish the story. Knowing that things had turned out positively was an enormous relief. But more than that, she was touched by his thoughtfulness in reaching out. In closing the circle their brief encounter had created, she wrote back immediately, thanking him for contacting her and expressing her relief that he hadn't faced serious consequences. She told him about the response the article had received, about all the people who had been moved by their story. She mentioned that her students had asked her to tell them more about her trip to London, and how the conversation with James had become her favorite part to share. Over the following weeks, Sarah and James exchanged several more emails. Their communication was friendly and warm, though neither pushed for anything beyond a pleasant correspondence. They shared more about their lives and their families. James told her about growing up in London, about the process of becoming a Royal Guard, about the pride and pressure that came with the position. Sarah shared stories about teaching, about her community in Ohio, about the ongoing process of learning to live without her father. Through their emails, Sarah learned that James was 24 years old, just 2 years younger than she had guessed. He had joined the military at 18, following in his grandfather's footsteps. The older man had served in conflicts that James didn't specify, but the respect in his words whenever he mentioned his grandfather made it clear that the man had been his hero. Losing him had been devastating, but it had also reinforced James's commitment to serving with honor. James was curious about Sarah's teaching career. He asked what subjects she taught and how she connected with her students. When Sarah explained that she taught American history to middle school students, he admitted that he had never been very good at history in school. It wasn't until he joined the military and learned about the traditions and battles that formed his unit's heritage that he truly understood why history mattered. Now he wished he had paid better attention in class. Sarah found herself looking forward to his emails more than she wanted to admit. There was something special about their connection, something that went beyond the unusual circumstances of their first meeting. They had met in a moment of shared grief and mutual respect, and that foundation created a bond that felt both comfortable and meaningful. She told herself it was just a friendship, that the distance between them made anything else impractical. But she couldn't deny the flutter in her chest when she saw his name in her inbox. One email from James included photos from his personal life, pictures that showed him out of uniform. There he was hiking in the countryside, grinning at the camera with mud on his boots. Another showed him at a family gathering, surrounded by what must have been aunts, uncles, and cousins, everyone laughing at something off camera. Sarah was struck by how different he looked when he smiled, how the seriousness of his guard duties transformed into boyish warmth. She sent him photos in return. Her classroom decorated for a history fair, her brother in his military uniform during a visit home, a sunset over the Ohio farmland where she had grown up. Through these images, they built a fuller picture of each other's worlds, adding color and context to the words they exchanged. Sarah's friends and family noticed a change in her. The shadow of grief that had hung over her since her father's death seemed lighter now. She smiled more easily, laughed more freely. Her brother commented on it during a phone call, saying he was glad to hear her sounding like herself again. When Sarah tried to explain that she had made a friend in London, her brother immediately guessed there was more to the story than she was letting on. She couldn't really argue with him. Her feelings for James had grown beyond simple friendship, though she was hesitant to examine them too closely. What was the point of developing romantic feelings for someone who lived 4,000 miles away? They had met by chance, shared a brief conversation, and now exchanged emails. It was nice, but it wasn't practical. Sarah had always been practical. She made sensible decisions, planned carefully, and avoided unnecessary risks, falling for someone she barely knew, someone whose life was so far removed from her own, was decidedly impractical. But the heart, Sarah was learning, didn't always care about practicality. James seemed to be experiencing his own version of uncertainty. His emails sometimes hinted at deeper feelings, little comments about wishing they could talk in person or wondering what it would be like to show her more of London. But he always pulled back, keeping things light and friendly. Sarah suspected he was being practical too, protecting himself from disappointment just as she was trying to protect herself. The turning point came 3 months after Sarah's trip to London. James sent her an email with an unexpected question. His unit was being honored at a ceremony, and families and friends were invited to attend. He knew it was probably impossible, but he wondered if Sarah might consider flying back to London for the event. He would understand if she couldn't, he added quickly, but having her there would mean a lot to him. Sarah sat at her desk, staring at the email for a long time. The practical voice in her head listed all the reasons to say no. The expense of another international flight, the difficulty of getting time off work, the risk of building expectations that might not be met. But another voice, quieter but more insistent, reminded her that some opportunities only came once. Her father had taught her that you regretted the chances you didn't take far more than the ones you did. She thought about what her dad would say if he could advise her now. He would probably tell her that life was short, that meaningful connections were rare, that it was worth being brave. He had never been reckless, but he had also never let fear stop him from pursuing what mattered. Her mother had once told Sarah that her father had proposed after knowing her for only 3 months because he had been certain she was special and didn't want to risk losing her. Sarah looked at the photos of James on her desk, printed copies of the digital images he had sent. She thought about their emails, the way he made her laugh, the depth of understanding they had found in each other. She remembered standing in front of Buckingham Palace, pouring out her heart to a stranger in a red uniform, and how that stranger had given her exactly what she needed in that moment. Maybe it was time to be brave again. She started typing her response. Yes, she wrote, she would love to attend the ceremony. She would need to check flight prices and talk to her principal about taking a few days off, but she would make it work. She wanted to be there to support him, to see him honored for his service, to continue the story they had begun that autumn day in London. After hitting send, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and terror. She had just committed to flying across the ocean, for a man she had spent less than 15 minutes talking to in person. It was completely unlike her, thoroughly impractical and potentially foolish. It was also, she realized with a growing smile, exactly what she needed to do. The weeks leading up to Sarah's second trip to London passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Her principal, who had read the viral article about the guard, was supportive of her taking time off. Her colleagues teased her good-naturedly about flying across the ocean for romance, though Sarah kept insisting it was just a friendship. Her students were thrilled by the real-life adventure their teacher was living, turning their history lessons into discussions about following your heart and taking chances. Sarah's brother called her the night before her flight. He had been protective since their father's death, taking on the role of family guardian even though Sarah was older, but his concerns about James had softened after she shared some of their email exchanges with him. Now he just wanted to make sure she was being smart and safe. The flight to London felt different this time, where her first journey had been tinged with grief and the weight of fulfilling a promise to her late father. This trip buzzed with possibility. Sarah found herself unable to focus on the book she had brought or the movies playing on the seatback screen. Instead, she kept imagining the moment when she would see James again, wondering if their connection would feel as strong in person as it did through emails. James had arranged to meet her at the airport. Sarah spotted him immediately as she emerged from customs, even though he was dressed in casual clothes and partially hidden by the crowd. He wore jeans and a jacket, his hair slightly longer than military regulations probably preferred. When he saw her, his face broke into the wide smile she had only seen in photographs. He was taller than she remembered, his presence somehow both more imposing and more approachable without the uniform. They stood looking at each other for a moment that felt suspended in time. Then James stepped forward and pulled her into a hug that felt both completely natural and electric, with new possibility. Sarah breathed in the scent of his cologne, felt the solidness of his embrace, and knew with certainty that making this trip had been the right decision. Over coffee at a small cafe near the airport, they talked for hours. The conversation that had begun in whispers outside Buckingham Palace and continued through months of emails now flowed effortlessly in person. James told her more about his family, his dreams of eventually becoming an officer, his fear that he might not be smart enough or good enough. Sarah shared her own insecurities about teaching, about whether she was making a real difference in her students' lives, about the loneliness she had felt since losing her father. That evening, James took Sarah to meet his grandmother, the widow of the grandfather he had mentioned during their first conversation. Mrs. Patterson was a small woman with sharp eyes and a warm smile. Her home was filled with photos of her late husband in various military uniforms spanning decades of service. She welcomed Sarah with tea and homemade biscuits, treating her like family rather than a stranger. Mrs. Patterson told stories about her husband, about the sacrifices military families made, about the pride that came with seeing someone you loved serve their country. She held Sarah's hand at one point and said, "My George would have liked you. He always appreciated people who understood what service meant." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "I wish I could have met him," the older woman smiled. "In a way, you did. James is so much like him. The best parts of him live on in my grandson." The ceremony honoring James's unit took place at a historic military building in central London. Sarah sat with James's family as various officers gave speeches about duty, honor, and tradition. When James's name was called, and he stood to receive his commendation for outstanding service, Sarah's heart swelled with pride. She thought about the day she had first seen him, ramrod straight in his red uniform, looking untouchable. Now she knew the man behind the guard, and watching him be recognized for his dedication meant everything. After the ceremony, there was a reception where Sarah met James's fellow guardsmen and their families. Several of them recognized her from the article, greeting her with friendly jokes about being famous. One soldier thanked her for writing something that showed them as real people, rather than just tourist attractions. His wife hugged Sarah and said the article had helped her own family understand what her husband did and why it mattered. As the evening wound down, James walked Sarah back to her hotel through London streets lit by street lamps and shop windows. They talked about everything and nothing, comfortable in the silence when conversation paused. At the hotel entrance, James hesitated before speaking. He told Sarah that these past months of knowing her had changed him. Meeting her that day at the palace had reminded him why he served, what he was protecting and honoring. Her emails had given him something to look forward to during difficult days. Her decision to fly back to London for his ceremony had touched him more deeply than he knew how to express. He knew they lived in different countries and had complicated lives, but he wanted to find a way to make this work if she did. Sarah felt her practical nature warring with her hopeful heart. The obstacles were real and significant. But standing there in the London night, looking at this man who had somehow become so important to her, she realized that some risks were worth taking. Her father had taught her that. This moment, this connection, this possibility of love, it was worth fighting for. She told James yes, she wanted to try. They would figure out the distance, the logistics, the challenges. It wouldn't be easy, but the best things rarely were. They had found each other in the most unlikely way, and maybe that meant they were supposed to find a way forward together. James kissed her then, gentle and hopeful, and Sarah felt something shift into place in her heart. The grief that had brought her to London the first time had transformed into something new. She would always miss her father, but she could also embrace the future and the unexpected gifts it brought. Over the next year, Sarah and James made their long-distance relationship work through video calls, emails, and visits whenever they could manage them. It wasn't easy. There were misunderstandings caused by time differences and miscommunications. There were nights when the distance felt unbearable, but there were also moments of joy that made every difficulty worthwhile. Eventually, James received a transfer to a military advisory position that involved travel to the United States. Sarah found opportunities to teach abroad during summer breaks. Slowly, carefully, They built a life that bridged the ocean between them. They talked about the future in concrete terms, making plans that once would have seemed impossible. Sarah often thought about that autumn day when she had stood before a royal guard, not expecting anything except to share a moment of memory and respect. She had been grieving, lost, searching for connection to her late father. Instead, she had found James, and in finding him, she had found a path forward through her grief and into a new chapter of her life. The article that had made their story viral remained online, occasionally being rediscovered and shared by new readers. Sarah still received messages sometimes from people who had been touched by it. Each message reminded her that their encounter outside Buckingham Palace had been about more than just two people connecting. It had been a reminder that humanity existed everywhere, even in the most formal circumstances, and that reaching out with authenticity and respect could create moments of magic. James eventually left active guard duty, though he remained in military service in other capacities. Sarah continued teaching, using their story to help her students understand that history wasn't just about dates and battles. It was about human connections, about the moments when people chose to see each other truly and respond with kindness. 3 years after their first meeting, James proposed to Sarah during a visit to Buckingham Palace. They stood in almost the exact spot where they had first spoken, where he had whispered thank you, and she had found comfort in an unlikely place. This time he went down on one knee in full view of tourists and guards alike, offering her a ring and a future together. Sarah said yes through happy tears, and the crowd around them burst into applause. One of the guards on duty, maintaining his perfect stillness, somehow managed to convey approval in the slight crinkle at the corners of his eyes. Sarah caught the expression and smiled, understanding now more than ever the balance between duty and joy, between protocol and humanity. Their wedding took place the following spring in Ohio, with James's family traveling from England and Sarah's students acting as junior attendants. Mrs. Patterson attended, bringing with her a photo of her late husband to place at the memorial table honoring loved ones who couldn't be there. Sarah's father's photo sat beside it, two military men who would never meet but whose legacies had brought together two people who might never have found each other otherwise. As Sarah and James exchanged vows, she thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with grief and respect, with a quiet conversation between strangers, with the courage to be vulnerable, and the wisdom to recognize something special when it appeared. She had gone to London looking for closure, and found instead an opening to unexpected love. Sometimes, she realized, the best things in life came from the moments when you let go of your plans and embraced the beautiful accidents the universe sent your way.